40 minutes and try to answer some questions towards the end. We'll try to do so as well. I know all of you joining us today have to get back to some work, and we thank you again for joining us on this topic. So really, who has access to your database is the topic of today. First, a couple of housekeeping items. We're going to go ahead. Just a little bit about the control panel that you have here. Obviously, a lot of you folks are very familiar with the technology we use, and if you already raised your hand when Jeff asked you, so you can open and close your panel, view selected, test your audio, which we've done, submit your questions, and that's a really nice part there where you can go ahead and submit your questions, so we'll try to answer it at the end. If we do not have time or it's going to be more of a complex answer to that, we'll go ahead and make sure we contact you after the webinar. Raise your hand, and obviously question and answers will be addressed as I mentioned, and everyone will receive a link in an email to the recorded presentation within 24 to 48 hours of this ending. So let's get started. So here's the topics that we're going to talk about. Who has access, so meaning who has access to your database? Why do they need access to your database? Obviously, those are just the simple things that we'll be discussing. How do they have access is really going to get more complicated. Why is understanding access important? You might be on projects where people are asking you, we need to drill into database users, we need to have an entitlement process. We'll talk a little bit why they might be asking you that. How can we limit the access is really around how can we set up a process in place where we can do this around understanding how do they have access, why do they need access, and who has actually access. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then we'll come to an understanding of how can we automate the process of understanding all the access control. Everything here, we're going to try to show you how to do that with App Detective towards the end of the game. So let's start. Who has access to your database? So I put this in a couple easy buckets for us to look at. So there's your database, and then you have, obviously database administrators have access to your database. If you're building your own homegrown applications, you have an application developer typically that has that. If you build your own application or even buy an application like a third-party ERP application that has a back-end database like a PeopleSoft or SAP or Oracle Business, typically has an application user there that's going to connect to the database. And why do they have that? Because all your users need to have access to the data, but you don't want to give your users each individual database account. That's just bad practice. So let's expand on this a little bit more. Why do they need access to your database? So database administrators, we all know that. They need to maintain the availability and performance of the database. They're really concerned about, okay, is this change going to break the database and the application? Are we performing well? Are we taking the transactions coming from the application and handling it to the best of the ability of the database? That's really what they're concerned about. And the type of level of access they need in that could be very privileged. They need to change functions. They need to change settings to make sure the performance of that is up to par, up to standard for the corporation. Simply, your application developer might need access to your database because they need to build the application. They need to know what the schema is within the database, so when they're building the application, they know all the proper business rules and logic, and the code that they're building is going to map up to the repository they have in the back end. Your application user, so the application developer is really going to build the application with an application user in mind. A lot of the time, this application user that is used with these application developers is typically a high privileged account. Sometimes it might be SA or root account in the database because they're not exactly sure all the business rules that need to happen when they're building the application. So they give the most privileged user for the application user sometimes because they're not sure eventually how everything's going to work. So starting from scratch there, sometimes a bad thing because you're giving it the ultimate power instead of figuring out first and then limiting the access there. Because at the end of the day, are you really going to go back in the cycle and change that particular application user based upon everything that you built upon? So tons of things can break if you were to go from that at the end of the project and moving back on that what you've done. So that application user is typically the gateway user to the database. And lastly, you have your users, your business users, your users if you have a commerce site and things like that. So if you're a bank and you have online banking, you have all these users that need to get access, to data. They're not thinking in their head they have access to a database. but to get access and process information. So that's a little bit about the users. But let's really expand upon our database user community. Who makes it up? So let's take those three little buckets there. Our technical users, database administrator and application developer. Let's really key on things here. So our technical user has very high privilege access. Let's look at the DBA. They're the administrators that are setting up the database itself, the database install, setting up schemas and things like that, doing all the work to help your application developer there. So these guys are going to need very specific access in there. They own the keys to the kingdom, and you need to go through change of control with them. So you need to really understand that user and what they're doing in the database and the actual privileges that they have, and we'll talk a little bit why you need to know about that. Then we talked about the application user. To expand on that really more, again, the application user is typically that database user created to pool all your business user functions. So if I'm going to make a particular transaction, I don't want to be, I don't want to have an application where my particular login has a database actual user in there. I want to be able to log into the application. The application user knows what to do with the database, and move on from there. And lastly, you have your business user. Your business user, and we talk about this, the actual access granted, we put that in quotes, all depends on how the application was configured with the database. You have legacy systems like HR systems that might be in place, or energy systems on old Oracle 7 databases and stuff like that, that were designed where if you needed access to certain data, well, you needed to be a database user account. You need to have a database account. And we've tons of legacy systems are like that. So there are some HR systems out there that each individual user, just to view their pay stub or view or clock their hours for vacation, actually have a database account because it's such an old archaic system, and it's tough to move off of that. So those are some of the tough situations. But typically we want the business user to have very limited access there at the database level. They shouldn't even know that they actually have full database access. If you think about it, the way the application's developed, you can have particular things, and we'll talk a little bit about why this is important, where SQL injection has a place in this. If you were to run a SQL injection and the application user is actually a root account, well, depending on what you're doing with SQL injection, you can make that actual application user do a lot of damage there. If it has the ability to delete actual records, it has the ability to insert actual records. That SQL injection that comes through is going to use that pooled application user account eventually to do all its bad work. So let's move on a little bit here. How do database users have access? And typically when we're talking about database users, we want to understand what is the user's effective privileges. The effective privileges meaning the actual access rights they have within the database. And we'll talk a little bit about here in these couple slides. So the first thing is you can have access directly granted to a user. So I can have grant select on salaries directly. That's typically a bad practice. You should have special role-based access control within the database. So Bob should have select on salaries through a role. And so you want to make sure you have roles associated. And typically when you're creating roles and things like that, you want to have them based on job functions. So you want to make sure everything maps up there. And you can see here access is granted by role. So Bob is a user. He's granted a developer role, and that developer role was granted an engineer role, which gives him the actual privilege of grant select on salaries. So Bob's effective privileges is that he can select on salaries. Now he didn't get that directly. He got that through a role, which another role gave him that actual access. So that's typically how you're seeing these things. But if you think about that, we'll expand a little bit more how users can be granted roles and roles can be granted privileges, but roles can also be granted other roles, and you have to really understand how they get their effective privileges. Well, when we continue on about that, when we talk about effective privileges, within the database, and depending on your database system, whether it be Oracle, SQL Server, Sybase, DB2, there are certain there's certain things that you can have within the database that deny or revoke a particular. So if we look at this example here, Bob, again, the user, is granted the employee role, and we also know he was granted the developer role. But here you can see that employee role is granted and directly, and now developer role is granted directly, and that developer role again is granted the engineer role, which gives him the grant. So he has directly granted 2 roles. So if we look on the last slide, he has effective privilege on salaries, but now because he's granted the employee role, he has deny select on that. So because of that single deny out of that one role, his effective privileges are actually none. He doesn't have it, even though we thought we gave it to him via this particular one, Bob, developer, engineer, grant on select on salaries. We have that same path here, but now he's given another role which gives him a deny on that salary table, and now he has effective privileges of none. So you have to really think about that, understanding that different roles can give different privileges, and how do they cancel all out is a hard thing to really manage and understand. There are other things within the database that could make things a little hairy, make things more like a spider web. You're really trying to understand how things are really moving around with privileges. So there's special privileges within databases, and here's an example with Oracle and SQL Server that provide implicit privileges. So if you look at SQL Server, there's a role there called DB_data writer. And this actual role gives select privilege on all tables to a particular database. So you can have it where it's, for example, like tempdb.db_data reader is a role for that tempdb database within a SQL Server. So if you try to really compute what the actual privilege is for a user that has this, and you try to do that for a script, because they have this particular role that gives select privilege on all the tables in a particular role, and you do a select on this particular user, you're not going to see that this specific role gives the specific access to select privileges on all tables. And that's just the way these special privileges are set up within the database. And it doesn't really cascade down to all effective privileges. Here it's an implicit privilege. Because you have this role, you're getting these special privileges. On Oracle, works similarly. You have system privileges like select any table, and if you were to give that to a user, this particular select any table will give the privilege to select on all tables within all schemas within that database. So that's a system privilege. That's the high system privilege that you need to know about. Now, depending on how you want to investigate how they got that, it could be 2 different ways. You can check to see if the user has select any table, or you can check other different various ways to see how they got access. But those are very interesting things within the database realm on how special privileges within the database can provide implicit privileges that all tie together in computing the user's effective privilege. So how can you compute the effective privilege of a single user? You have folks that think that they can do it. If you try to find SQL queries around this, you can go to some sites. There's some tools out there that are there. I know on the Oracle side, Pete Finnegan has a SQL script there that provides you some information, but it doesn't go down to the level that you really need to do to compute the overall effective privileges. So can I write a SQL query to gather this data? The answer is really no. You can't do it to compute all the effective privileges of that. And to really justify why it's a no is because if you look here on the left, it's users can be granted direct access. We talked about in the beginning. Users can be granted roles, and those roles can be granted other roles. We looked at that with Bob was granted that one role, that granted the other role, that granted him the select on salaries table. And these granted roles can give a user a chain of roles, and all those roles are granted privileges. So if you think about it, you could think about it as a ladder, a chain, whatever you want to do. It could be a never-ending particular chain of how access is granted to a particular user. And obviously, we're going to the extreme measures here of trying to present that situation. You can have users that you can manage your roles properly, but in actuality, if you look at your development or you look at canned applications, a lot of the times you're going to have roles granted, roles granted, roles granted, roles. And that's just the way we work today. It's just, you can call it lazy, you can call it careless, but at the end of the day, we need to produce for what the job needs. And if the easiest way is to do it through granting role relationships, we're going to go ahead and do it and get back to our lives as a database administrator to make sure that my performance is on par with everything that needs to do. So if you look on the right here, how do you need to figure this out? Well, first you need to determine all the direct access to the user. So, okay, give me the user and show me all the access that they have, direct access. We need to determine which roles are granted to the user. So let's go ahead and figure this out here. Okay, take the user and tell me all the roles associated with that. Now from that, we have to determine, okay, what roles are granted to the roles. So after we've determined the roles that are granted to the users, let's look at all those individual roles and then enumerate all the roles that are granted to those roles. Okay, it gets, again, hairy, very spider web-like. Then you need to determine the privileges granted to each of the roles. So that's a multi-step process where you're trying to figure this out. If you try to do that for a single user on a single database, data that can get. Think about how time-consuming that can get. Just by cascading, running queries on a single user, running queries on a role, running queries on a privilege, all those different things are tough to do, and then tough to join together. So if you think about it, simple table joins won't allow for all this complete analysis to really compute a user's effective privilege, or that matter, a role's effective privilege. Now, we talked about deny and revoke. How do you really compute that within all this? That means you really have to have an understanding and have a huge map of understanding all the roles, where the privileges are. So if this user is granted this role and that role, okay, well, does that role have particular revoke or deny and privilege, which is going to cancel out the actual access he gets from another role? That is really, really complicated stuff. So for you to do that with a SQL query, it's just not possible. So why is this important? Well, this is important because we needed to manage the risk responsibly. If we talk about the database user, the application user, and the business users, why do we need to do it? Because it's a security best practice for us to do so. Okay, if you just think about how everything fits together, it's very moving parts, and it can change instantly if you need an application change. So if you know a change needs to happen now, we're in a very environment that we change a lot of stuff, or we're in an environment where not a lot of changes there, so it's a little bit easier to manage. But typically, we're in an environment where we need to change stuff on the fly, and changing stuff on the fly means that, hey, we're just going to go ahead and do the easiest thing possible. So sometimes the security best practice is lost here. You could have insider mistakes and insider abuse. So we all know that a high privileged user like a DBA or application developer, it has to have a good amount of access to that schema. And DBA has access in there. They can make a mistake, or they can abuse it. That business user, depending on how the application was built, again, could actually make a mistake because he accidentally does something within the application, and he shouldn't actually have the access to do that because he's just only trying to make a business function change, which he knows about. But a mistake can happen and change the entire game at the database level because he had high privileged access that he didn't need. Then we talk about external threats and SQL injections. So again, the example here is that typically you have your application user as root or SA when you're building that, when you have your application, because you're not at the start of it, you're not sure what all the functionality of the application needs to be. So let's give it the high privileged user. So when we build all our business logic for the application and code it, we know all our transactions are going to make it to the database and everything's going to happen. But you can have if you have improper code within your web application, and SQL injections can happen. Well, that high privilege access is really going to come back to haunt you, because now I can create a SQL injection. So if that high privilege access allows me to do a delete statement, if it allows me to do an insert statement, well, I can go directly to any of the tables that I had access to through that, and obviously do damage within the database. And typically, that's happening a lot. We know that SQL injection has been around for a long time here, 10, 12 years. We know that SQL injection is still the most used type of attack vector out there. So that's why it's really important. Why is it important? Well, if it comes down to compliance, if you have your boss saying, you know, we really need to do this for SOX compliance, PCI, there's some HIPAA stuff, obviously we need to know why and understand why. So obviously SOX we typically know about. We're mandated of segregation of duties. So typically we're trying to see, okay, within our financial systems, if it goes down to the database, who has access to that, who can actually tamper with that actual data. PCI, there's a bunch of stuff there around restrict access to Colorado data by business needs to know, and obviously there's a bunch of things that you can check in place there. So there, you have HIPAA, everything's going to EPHI. You want to restrict authorized access to EPHI, instrument policy and procedures to restrict the access. So really it's around programmatically trying to figure out what you want to do, and then have the right tools enabled to, that allow you to enforce it. You're with FSMA or anything like that, you have NIST 853 framework that talks about it, dealing with DIACAP and DISSIG. There's a bunch of different things that really point to this area. And typically, they won't point down to the database level, and a lot of the times you have subject matter experts that say, okay, we need to look at database level, or your boss is going to come down to you and say, we really need to drill down to that. So how can we limit access? Limiting access is really comes down to entitlement programs and process programs. Who really owns this type of work at the database level. It can be very complementary to your identity management access systems of people there. Does it come down to the people within security and security configurations? Do we really need to burden the DBAs to actually own this process? So you have to really figure that out, and it's going to be different for every operation. It's going to be different for every company. You have to figure out your own politics within that. But there are some things here that are key in this 5-step wheel here that we're going to discuss a little bit, and then show you how you can automate some of this stuff with App Detective. So first you want to document users' roles, groups, and permissions. That's the first baseline. We talked about Bob can have access to this, but how do you really document that? This is probably the hardest part to do, and this is probably the thing that you need tools to help you get that information. This is a discovery period where you're just saying, okay, show me all the users. Okay, let's weed out all the users. Again, it's a people, process, technology type of thing. All right, these are all the roles, and these are the groups, and these are all the permissions that's granted. Let's figure out how this works within our environment. And obviously, you're probably going to take this a critical application at a time, because trying to do it all at once it's just going to get you nowhere. It's going to be counterproductive. So if you take let's take that one critical system that says this is the one that runs our business. This is our banking system. This is our database. These are our users, and this is all the business logic around that. That business logic is very important. So you need to know if the business logic is going to map down to the actual privilege levels within the database and the application. So that's the hardest part, number one. Reviewing and improving it obviously goes hand in hand with one and two. They go hand in hand with documenting. So once you get that information, you really have to sit down with the business and say, okay, these particular users just need to do this. Okay, if we marry that to the role and the user or application user or the roles that are granted to it, does that marry up? Okay. From there, once you've got that 1 and 2 down, the hardest part, you can continuously audit the user's access to critical data. So within those systems, beyond just getting understanding of the user's roles and permissions, obviously there's going to be that critical data that you want to access, understand the access to. So you could really monitor that critical access. So if it's an HR system that says, okay, the employee table has a bunch of different columns that we want to make sure who has access to that. So you take it from that perspective. You already know which users should be in that system. You already know what users should actually have access to that. So you want to continually audit that user access to that critical data. From there, once you've done that, you want to conduct proper remediation if you need to. You want to work with your administrators, your change control process to really step up here. And then you want to ensure permissions remain accurate within your documented policy. So you're going to have to periodically do this. So the whole process starts again. But once you get that initial baseline, you just want to do some deviations on that, right? You want to check the differences on that. You may even want to monitor for changes there. So you can do all the initial stuff, which is the heavy lifting stuff initially. But once you've got it down, you can really set maybe a database activity monitoring policy on certain things that might trigger any activity that you might want to notice. So that's really how you can limit access. So really, how can we automate this process? Really around steps 1 and 2 and 3 with App Detective Pro. So it's a circle, it's a process. So let's get a spin on things. So right now I'm going to jump into App Detective. And we're going to go look into App Detective. and see what we can do with App Detective as far as this process. Again, number one, document users' roles and permissions and review and improve them. And how can we use technology to really enable our people in the process to do so. So if you're not familiar with App Detective is a database security assessment solution. You're able to take it, discover databases, and then really do discovery on the things that we need to do, document users' roles and permissions. And we're really going to focus on that functionality with the tool today. So here I have an Oracle database that we scan, and we have some information. So there's a couple things that we want to do. Again, we want to catalog all the permissions and the access right there. So you can run this user rights functionality. This user rights functionality is going to get all our information. It's going to run to the database, collect information, create a snapshot of our users, our roles, and the permissions they have to all the different objects within the database. So all the privileges there are going to be mapped. That's one thing that we need to do. But then we talked about all the special privileges that give implicit privileges, certainly. So sometimes you want to audit that access. So you have the ability within the tool to create policies right around that. So what I can do is here, first I'll open the policy editor, and we'll go to audit policies because we're connecting to the database and gathering information. Here I created a user policy called Privileged User Assessment for Oracle. So if we hit that selected, you can create whatever you want, but we have access control category, a bunch of checks. And we're looking here again, system privileges give special privileges. So we were looking at like select any table and with table space. So I can select whatever I want here. I can really go in here and choose the things that I want to look for. So if we look at some stuff enables like sysdba privilege assignments, okay, check that sysdba privilege assignments are granted to unauthorized databases. DBAs, system privilege granted to account, system privilege for any clause. So create any table, alter any table, drop any table, select any table, alter any procedure. Again, that's a system privilege that gives the any category to anybody who has it. Pretty much has free reign in all the schema. So that's the thing that we want to check for. So once we've really figured it out, we run the audit, and we can get information here. So we ran the audit, and we have a bunch of 1,514 issues that came up. Here's where we really need to go in and document some things. So it's a baseline that we can see. We can see a bunch of users. We can see a bunch of privileges based upon what actual check was run. We can go ahead and view it. So how can I view this simply? I can either scroll through here and look at that, or I can do go to this Edit Vulnerability Management to have a nicer view of things. Now I can really view the details. So if we look here, we can look at that, or I can export to a report, do a find that I want to do in the text or crystal or PDF, whatever I need to do. So that's one thing. I can find out the access to who has selected any table. That's one part of it. So that's really dealing with system privileges and special privileges that get it through permissions. That's one part of what we can do. We've already done the user analysis review scan, and we really need to dig into reports. So let's talk about a couple things here. So if I go to a report tab and go here, I want to look at some data, right? I want to understand who are my users in my database. So I can do that two different ways. So I can go here to my audit. I collect user information here. So I'm going to generate user information here. See a bunch of things with my Oracle. I'm going to see that I have an A. Windsor. We didn't collect the password here. It's unlocked. It's unexpired. He has normal privileges. A bunch of people have normal privileges with my database. Here, I have the sys account. It has sysdba privilege. Okay, that's right. That's great. But the privilege being normal, is that right or is that wrong? Is that misleading? I don't know. So we can see here, we're going to key on this vrauth user for walking through this a little bit. So let's key on this vrauth user. From my user information report, it says that vrauth is unlocked, unexpired, and has normal privileges. That's good, right? He should only have access to certain things. Now vrauth will take this for this example as a technical user, maybe as an application developer. So we'll close it out. I got information. Okay, I can generate the report. I have some user information here. I know my user in the database. Okay, what types of roles are in my database? So if I go to reports here, I go to user rights review reports. I can go, okay, all roles in my database. I can say that from there. I can do all roles for roles. So when I talked about, okay, what a particular role has, and all the different roles that it has from there. So you could get all these, document all these things within the tool. So if I give you an example of like, all roles for a role, I select that snapshot again. I could say, okay, let's take just this, DBA role or his EJB client role and see what all the different roles have. So the tool allows you to do that. So that's what you have there. But let's really drill into this on the 3 types of users. Okay, let's think about that VROTHED user. It said he's a user in my database that has normal privileges. So sometimes the first things I want to do are understand who has DBA role, because we know that anybody who has DBA role has a very high privileged account. So what I'll walk you through here is now who has the effective members for a role. So if we take this and say who has DBA role, we're really going to key in on this. So this means that I should only have a couple users here, right? So what this is going to show me is a report of all effective members for a role of DBA. And if I look at here, you have a granted directly. Yes means it was directly granted. So if you go back to the example on the slides, we saw that Bob was directly granted a role. So this is DBA's role. So we see that CTXsys, which is a built-in Oracle user, is granted DBA role. Then you see a bunch of no's here. No, 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 no. So GTROG, J Fairchild, and here again VROTHED has DBA, is part of is an effective member of DBA role, but is not directly granted it. So as you saw from the slides there, roles can be granted roles there. So this is how VROTHED gets to be an effective members of role. It seems like although he wasn't directly granted DBA role, it seems that another role that he has was granted DBA role. So how do you really expand upon that? You can do that by actually looking at his effective privileges for that user. So this is all part of documenting your user's roles and permissions and having reports to sit down with your application developer, sit down with your business owner of the application and say, okay, we have these users, let's understand if its rights are appropriate. So the next report I could do to really understand the effective privileges for that user, I can go ahead and select that user. Again, we'll choose that. We'll look for that user here. We'll say VROTHED, and we'll go ahead and generate the report for him. So we'll go ahead and generate that report here, which is already generated here. And here you'll see 524 pages of privileged access that this user VROTHED has. Again, he could be a technical user in the system, depending on how the application was set up. He could actually be an employee, and he could be a business user. And oh, by the way, because we have an old archaic legacy system, in order for any activity that he needs to do from the business level, required all this access. So it all depends, again, how that's created. But you can see 524 pages here. VROTHED has a connect role, so he needs to connect to the database. Okay, that's fine. VROTHED has a resource role. Does he need to have that? Create system privileges. Then you see here, about halfway down the page, the first notion of that role inheritance, that role granted a role. VROTHED is the user. He has a scan services role, and now he's granted DBA role. This particular access here is now going to spit out 522 more pages worth of access for this particular user, because we know that DBA role gives quite a lot of system privilege access in our database. It's a very high privilege user account. It is the God account in Oracle. So just by this particular association with this role, he gets a ton and ton and ton of privileges. Is that right? Is that wrong? Well, that's really why we need to document it and have a review and approval process. So what App Detective here is doing is enabling you from an easy perspective of running a snapshot, running reports to document your user's roles and permissions for a database or multiple databases. Again, you might want to look at this as single database at a time because of the criticality of that database and that application system. You have a process to review it. So once you've done that, you've established if this is right access or not. There are some key objects, right? Number 3 was continuously audit users' access to critical data. So we know that this system might be an HR system. So we want to be able to look from a table perspective, exactly what type of access is being there. So on a periodic basis, maybe monthly, maybe quarterly, we want to make sure that we key on who has access to this object. So if we go there and select that, we're going to key in on here. So this object access report is going to allow us to select a particular object, whether it be a table or view. And views might be important because you might be following some security best practice policies. You might be following CIS benchmark policies where views within Oracle are things that you might need to document who has access to. But let's look at this table here. And we'll type in HR. We know it's an HR system. We'll go to HR employees. We'll hit next. Now we want to see who has access to this particular table. This is an audit practice that we can do, so we can go ahead and look at it, right? We'll go ahead and look at it and say, okay, who has access to it? So HR schema owner has access to it. That's okay. That's okay. CCA Assist owner, Oracle user has access to it. We know that's a built-in Oracle user. Is this the right access? Delete, insert, select, update. Maybe we don't even need to have that user here anymore. Okay, that's a built-in Oracle user. We're not using that as our application user, so let's remove that. That's a conversation that can have. DBA role, that's okay. Xfull full database, that might be okay. Okay, gtrog, he's a user. Is he? What type of user is he? Is he an administrator? Is he a business user? Why is he here? And you can really drill into the fact of that. And again, this could also lead into the process once you're doing that to do a drill into that particular user. So when we looked at that all effective privileges for a user for vRauthhood, by running a report like this and I see a user that might be questionable, I can run that same type of report for this particular user. So I can say, gtrog, he has delete, insert, select, update. How did he get that? And what that's really going to show you, what I showed you was that grant path. It's really going to help you identify how to revoke it. And from there, you're going to understand. Because from our perspective, we take into all the considerations when we do our computation, which is hard to do from just a SQL query. When we do our computation, we understand those revokes. We understand those denies. So when we truly compute the effective privileges, we take everything into consideration of what I showed you today. But that's really the process of what needs to happen when you're dealing with who has access within the database. And those are the key things that this tool can bring to your people and process. This technology is really going to be beneficial and help you. And it's going to give you independent validation. You don't have to ask the administrator for all this information. The administrator could hide details. Here you can actually just say, Mr. Administrator, I just need access to the system. This is the type of access that I need. Please set it up. I'm going to run this tool, and we're going to have a conversation a week from now after I've run all my reports. I've sat with my business owners, and we need to figure out how to revoke access for particular users, how to remove users because they're not even within the company anymore, or this application user needs to be changed because we're changing the way our business needs to function. Those are the conversations that you could build into the process, and this is what the tool enables these things to happen. So if we go back to the slides here, we talked about how we can automate the process with an App Detective, and it's a very straightforward tool for folks have seen it or not. It really takes a lot of the spider web types of things that we really need to understand and analyze. All the stuff that we've talked about. How does access get here, here, and here? App Detective will really show you. So from that perspective, we'll do a summary. Who has access we talked about. There's, 3 types of users that are simple users that you can put in your head: technical users, database administrators, and application developers. Then you have an application user who's really there because you're building an application on that, or it's a built-in ERP application that does a pooled account to the database, so your business function users don't have to have a database user account. Your business users are just connecting to the database, connecting to the application, doing whatever they need to do within the application, and there you have it. So you don't really need to do that. You don't really need to have activity monitoring if you do all this heavy lifting up front and really understand what the access is there. We talked about why is this important. There's a bunch of different things. It's security best practices. It fits into a lot of these regulations and compliance issues that we're always dealing with. And this is just another thing that, you've been doing the compliance things for several times. Now a new audit happens, and this might be a finding that comes up. You're really not looking at your database user access, and you can't justify a way to show me how this is correct or not. So that's really the summary there. We know this is a tough problem to solve, and that's why we put all this technology within App Detective. Now, with that said, we move into an introductory offer that we have here. Jeff mentioned how we can help you do this. Because we know this is such a tough situation, we have an introductory offer. If you've been following us, our company, we announced about a month ago an effort to really get App Detective in the hands of people that need it and just need to see it. So we offer a no-cost one-year license, and all you have to do is give us a call, set up a call with one of your sales advisors, and you'll get a single cost of a license per year for a single database, and you'll be able to run your audit so you can really see who has system privileges that give all these special privileges out to users, and you can run the full user rights review to run all the reports to really see here. Again, there's some restrictions that may apply, but this is really valid for new accounts. So if you're new with us today and you've never done anything with us, never purchased licenses, this might be the right thing for you. With that said, I'll open up to Jeff, give it back to him, and see if there's any questions. But if you need to contact us, you can contact us at sales.appsecinc.com, or if you want to chat with me directly, I'm available at mtrinidad@appsecinc.com. So we'll throw it back to Jeff to see if there's any questions.
Thanks, Mark. So we have a couple of questions coming in, and if you want to ask a question, please make sure to use the control panel in the questions and answers section and type in your question, and we will try to get that in the next couple of minutes. So I guess the first one that comes in, Mark, is about, just give me 1 second to paraphrase this. So for the reports, does App Detective Pro give the ability to show the delta in terms of what's been changed in the database when someone's been added or removed?
Yeah, we do have delta reporting. So you could do a bunch of different things. You could do delta reporting on the effective privileges for a user. Delta reporting on effective privileges for a role. So there's a bunch of different deltas that you could do there, and you can add that within the process of what you want to do.
Okay, next question comes in, and it's about system accounts in the database, and how do we handle system accounts in terms of access?
So system accounts in the database, those are obviously always really hard for you to figure out. The best thing that you could do is use a tool like App Detective just to see what they have access to. So a lot of system accounts are going to give high privilege access. So from there, you're just really going to need to see what they drill down to, and then from there you really need to see, okay, why do we need these system accounts here? What are they being used for? You have a lot of people that have granted to public role, and our application won't break because we don't have it. They're a daunting task, but if you put the effort on it, you could really take some of these built-in system accounts and built-in system privileges and really refine your roles around your application to support that theory of least privileged account access for these things.
Great. Next question's around how App Detective Pro works. I've used App Detective Pro before in the past for vulnerability assessment. Is the user rights piece the same product or a different product?
So user rights is just another functionality within App Detective. It is separate licensable within products. So if you have App Detective today, if you're a current customer and only can do the audit portion, you just call us up and say we're interested in doing user rights. You can do an evaluation of it first, and if it fancies your boat, you buy the license for that. But again, it's separately licensed. It has a different license account, but it brings a lot of different data for you to look at, different from the audit, and it brings a lot of great information that you can use along with the audit. So that's how it works.
Great. Just two more quick questions, and we're going to go ahead and wrap up. So one question is, will this has come in a couple of times, will this be recorded and available? And the answer is yes. We'll have a recording out to everyone who's attended or registered within the next 24 to 48 hours so that you can watch something if you missed part of the presentation or forward it off to a colleague that may have not been able to join us today. Last question is, what type of reports are available to show audit history? This might be related to the first question, Mark, but maybe you might be able to answer that a little bit
Can you repeat that one again?
So what kind of reports are available to show the audit history?
So it really depends on that, and that's something that you probably want to drill in the tool a little bit more. Audit history is one thing, of what you want to do. We're here typically trying to understand there. So the reports on the difference, you'd see that. If you're really trying to get audit functions, I mean, these are all, again, user rights review is a snapshot in time. So if you have snapshots in time and you do differences, that's what you're going to see. But if you really wanted to look at things more real time at an audit function, you could look at our product called DBProtect with database activity monitoring, which really will show you everything that particularly happens with change. So if a revoke, deny happens there, if a insert, select, update happens there, so all the DDL, DCL, DML commands are generated there, and you have very granular reports where you can take all that information. So this is monitoring or auditing that is off the database, and you're using software that we provide and gives you ton of rich auditing information and reporting that you could use there.
That sounds great. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining today. Again, if you have any questions, please contact Mark Trinidad, mtrinidad@appsecinc.com, and look for some follow-up information on how you can take advantage of the AppDetective Pro one-year license coming shortly. Again, thanks a lot. And Mark, any final thoughts?
My final thoughts is exactly what Jeff said. If this is an actual problem within your company or something that you're looking to solve, is really just reach out to us. We can help you solve it with AppDetective Pro. Walk you through all the different reports again. Just contact us, and we'll have someone walk you through and handhold you through some of the reports in the process.
Sounds great. Well, thanks everyone today, and have a great rest of the day.